So what does this mean for implications? There's some important things. The first is that adolescents are just developing in this region, particularly early adolescence, the ability to control their impulses, to be civilized. You know, that seed of civilization is developing. But what's even more critical than that? And yes, all of you, your kids, they can use judgment. They can control their impulses. They can do these things. They have the capacity. It's developing. But what's more important is that because this part of their brain is undergoing all this change, they actually have found that adolescents are relying on other parts of their brain when it comes to making a decision. So I'll talk about a very basic task that they do. So they put children, adolescents, and adults into that MRI scanner, and they give them a really simple task. They'll show them a picture of a face with an expression on it and ask them what emotion is on this face. And what they find is that adolescents are more likely to misjudge the emotion. This is kind of interesting, a side note, could be a totally other talk. They're more likely to report a face as angry than children or adults. Why would that be? Like if you think this is developmental, that means it's got some evolutionary capacity. Why would that be the case, that adolescents would be more likely to see a face as angry? Okay, so they're maybe more used to seeing that. Yeah.
Then we do.
Is there anything like adaptive? Okay, so they're going through puberty. They're biological beings. They hit that time when they're reaching the ability to reproduce, and they see all these faces and they're more likely to see anger. The thought is it could be a protective mechanism, this idea because what are you supposed to do when you can sexually reproduce? When you're a biological creature? You're supposed to sexually reproduce. That's what you're designed to do, and that's what you're being signaled to do, is to seek independence, to get out on your own, and to establish your own family, really. Is that what we want our adolescents to be doing? No. No. And so, but this is, if we think about what our bodies biologically are designed to do. So what they find is that adolescents are asked to look at these images, and adults use their prefrontal cortex. So the prefrontal cortex is showing lots of heat and energy on the MRI. Adolescents are using a part of their brain called the amygdala, which is located right here. And the cool thing about the brain is that this part of the brain that's in the internal stem, anybody know what's unique about that part of the brain? Again, thinking evolutionarily, this is what we share with most animals. This is what makes us human. That thing is very sensitive. So when adolescents are doing this exact same task, they're using the amygdala, which is this sort of animalistic fight or flight impulsive reaction. So that's important, that adolescents are more likely to make judgment and decision using a part of their brain that's much more impulsive. It's not meant to provide logical, reasoned judgments. Not a surprise to, I mean, I'm sure like that you've experienced this. You can totally have adolescents that have learned to use this part of their brain. You can have an adolescent who will practice and gain capacity. Doesn't mean you're at a loss. Doesn't mean that your kid will never make a rational judgment. But what it does mean is that biologically they're driven to do this. And so, again, we'll think about this issue of safety nets. So that's the first tail, the first brain system. So we take this and then we have to add it to these other important things that are happening, which is this emotional piece. So at the same time, again with puberty, adolescents' brains have a reduction in dopamine receptors, and I'll talk about, like, so what does that mean? And they have an increase, their brain, so this means that the neural receptors that pick up dopamine shrink in adolescence, and the neural receptors that pick up oxytocin increase. So what is dopamine? Dopamine is our feel-good neurotransmitter. We seek it daily. It's what makes us feel happy. And what are some of the things that you think increase dopamine for us? Exercise, physical activity increases dopamine, makes us feel good. You know, even if you don't want to do it, usually you feel better afterwards, and that's a lot of this dopamine production. What other kinds of things do you think might increase dopamine?
Food.
What?
Food.
Food, yeah, chocolate. I mean, definitely. There's substances that increase dopamine for us that make us feel better. Sex increases dopamine. For some people, it may be, you know, shopping, those kinds of things that they trigger our head that we're feeling good, we're feeling pleasure. And adolescence, which is opposite of what we would think, their receptors for that feel-good neurotransmitter are actually more limited during this developmental period. And so what do you think that means? Why might that be the case, and what might be the result of that? So if the kinds of receptors that are picking up that hormone that or the neurotransmitter that allows us to feel good.
They're not doing it.
They what?
Well, they're not doing some of those things, right?
Okay, so this idea that, well, it may be that they're just not doing those things so they can't feel good, but think about adolescent behavior.
Maybe from an evolutionary standpoint, the body wanted to control that aspect because the logic and reasoning wasn't as strong.
Yeah, so logic and reasoning is not as strong, so maybe we want to control some of that, but even what it maybe even complicates this a little bit more, because you're right on with the sort of what's adaptive about this, is that adolescence, and this is, you know, I should say that this isn't 100% like, no, this is something that scientists have tried to explain and have come up with some good explanations based on science, but their argument is that adolescents actually have to up the ante a little bit to feel that dopamine. They actually have to, they're encouraged by their brain to actually up the level of excitement a little bit. So I know when I was an adolescent, like I loved roller coasters. I would never do that now, like never go on them now. And it's like, so why evolutionarily, kind of opposite of maybe what you were thinking, would we want adolescents at this age of 14, 15, 16, 17 to need to push the limits in order to get that pleasure? Like, what would be adaptive about that?
Well, they have to start being more, they have to start being more on their independent and going out and doing things farther afield from their nest.
Yeah, really, exactly. So the thought is that you need separation to occur, and what's going to make you separate? A desire to take risk, a desire to find novelty. If you, as an adolescent, are completely comfortable and happy at the status quo, then the thought is you won't be motivated then to get out. But our kids don't get out at age 14, 15, 16, right? And many times much later. And so we're kind of working against a little bit a biological process. So the argument is that adolescents may actually be driven for risk because of their brain. Their brain's telling them, I want to seek more. And if you have an adolescent who's sort of temperamentally already more likely to want risk, that just kind of piles on. And I want you to remember that risk doesn't mean bad. So we kind of have to think about that and keep that thought in your head. So at the same time that's happening, and there's gender differences, by the way. Boys, you see, they are even more, they have sort of even more of this decrease in dopamine, because if you think evolutionarily, males are the ones who have to do the protection and seek that So there are these gender differences, and there's gender differences here too. Then we see the receptors for oxytocin expand and pick up everything. And oxytocin is our love hormone or our bonding hormone. And so when is oxytocin high as an adult? Breastfeeding is one of the times that you can find really high levels of oxytocin. Biologically, a woman is breastfeeding her baby. Her body is releasing oxytocin. It's being picked up in the brain, and it's telling her to love this being in her arms. Doesn't mean that you don't love your baby if you don't breastfeed, but it's that biological thing that's happening. We experience high levels of oxytocin during sex, and this is just cool, I think, that people, my students in human sexuality often ask me, like, about, can you really have like emotionless sex? And our bodies aren't really designed to do that, because for both males and females, oxytocin levels go up during physical intimacy, and they actually stay up after orgasm or after an act of physical intimacy is over. Not for a long time, like 15, 20 minutes, they stay pretty high. And so it's bonding you with that person that you're intimate with. Adolescents have high levels of oxytocin reward when they're with their peers. Girls have even more neural capacity for oxytocin. And so what does this mean about adolescence? What are you thinking about your own kids as you hear this? We don't have to think of the sex stuff. Let's just Yeah, because they're getting a lot of cognitive reward from that time with their friends. And the other thing is that those peer experiences become hyper important. And so you had any kids yet that have had a loss, a loved, broken heart? Not yet. You think like, how can you be this torn up by a 6-week relationship with, but the thing is that they feel so intensely connected to their peers at this point that is how intense it feels. And so we have to some way appreciate and respect and have empathy for that. And even remember how connected we often feel cognitively to our first love or our first sexual experience. We're meant to kind of do that. And why would we be meant to do that? The exact same reason. We're meant to go out and establish a family and a level of our own peer group and independence from our family. So adolescents are heavily influenced by their peer group. Part of it's because they spend a lot of time with them. But part of it's because their brain is giving them a lot of cues to see them as very, very important. So the consequences of this part of the brain, this emotional piece, is that adolescents are driven to seek sensation and newness. Their brains are telling them, go out, do exciting things, do new things. They're heavily influenced by their peers. And the other thing is there's this hot-cold cognition that, so I'll give you an example with driving. You brought up the driving piece. They do driving simulators with adolescents. So they put them in a simulating machine and they give them, there's a yellow light, there's a car that's going slower that they could pass, there's a speed limit. And adolescents, when they're in that machine themselves, they make the same driving decisions that adults do. They stop at the yellow light, they don't pass the car when it looks risky, all of those things. And then when they bring one peer into the simulator with them, they run the yellow light, they pass the car at the riskier time. So adolescents do have the capacity to try to reduce this seeking sensation. And that's what you think of as the cold cognition, when there's not emotion involved, when there's not another peer involved. They can make sort of the same adult decisions. But the minute you make it hot by putting an emotional charge or a peer charge into it, some of that judgment goes away. And so what do we do about this then? How do we handle this information? Because it sounds all kind of maybe scary, But how can we as adults try to make it not so scary? And I'll show you this as well, just because the substance use piece of this. This is the brain of a 15-year-old male non-drinker, and this is a difference between a 15-year-old who doesn't drink and a 15-year-old who's a heavy drinker. And they're asked to do the same cognitive test under the functional MRI, and the lighting up means activity in the brain. So you can see the 15-year-old non-drinker versus the 15-year-old heavy drinker.
Is this
And-
while under the influence for the drinker guy, or is it just like while he's sober, but he is?
That's a great